As Mafex plays catch up with their delayed releases, I play my own catch up with reviews that I'm a little behind on, and that's for Mafex number 239, the comic based Spider Man 2099. Of which some of you may know from some history kind of preserved here on the channel that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the 2099 Miguel O'Hara Spider-Man. I like the concept of a futuristic Nueva York, as they put it, and also having a different form of a Spider-Man in the form of Miguel O'Hara, so not necessarily Peter Parker, since it's so far into the future that at that point Peter Parker is long since dead. So having somebody else take up the mantle, pick up where he left off, and at the same time being very futuristic, but also, in my opinion, the more interesting aspect about Miguel O'Hara is that he's meant to be a much more aggressive, slightly antagonizing version of Spidey. I was a little apprehensive as to whether or not I should put down a pre-order for a very comic-based, very straightforward interpretation from Mafex for $20.99. But after that recent comic-based Daredevil that I was completely in love with, that was able to move me into putting down this pre-order around the same time that the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, which is technically the Tobey Maguire from No Way Home, also went live up for pre-order. Well, we kind of know already at that point how that one turned out with my recent review, so it was a bit of a flip of the coin to see that I unboxed that guy, felt the way that I did about him, only to then kind of perform a somewhat 180 with the comic-based version here, because it does kind of get a little bit closer to what I enjoyed about the Daredevil figure, because it's meant to be a bit more comic-based and therefore a little bit more simplistic in nature as far as detailing on the suit, as far as sculpt work, texture work, all that stuff. It's not meant to be incredibly intricate, and you're definitely able to pick up on that from the color scheming. I do really love this clash as far as the specific hue of the darker muted red, but at the same time it's this blue. It's like a navy blue, a much darker navy blue that you're accustomed to as far as like clothing or apparel, but it really works to translate the Spider-Man 2099 deco. And overall, having the angular designs to not only the symbols on the front as well as the ones that are kind of bleeding and connected to the arrows on his arms, the hands, and stretching all the way across the shoulders is just, as the kids like to say these days, peak 2099 Spidey. Or at least for the majority of the symbols, since the hue of red that's painted over the top part of the abdomen here is a shade brighter than the remainder of the symbols, so a little bit of consistency would have been appreciated here. So there's not much in the way of like deco to highlight, except that it's overall done really well as far as quality assurance. Nothing feels like it's bleeding over, nothing feels like it's messed up, everything feels on point to the extent that I almost feel like I'm able to reinforce a little bit of that theory that I was kind of bringing up during the Mafex Friendly Neighborhood Spidey, the Tobey Maguire figure, where I was mentioning how they probably have parted teams to work on specific figures, and I feel like that A team, or at the very least the B team, who may have had some kind of involvement with that Daredevil figure, even if it's a reissue or just being able to kind of like remaster it to bring another release out of it, was then brought on to work on 2099 and kind of leapfrog across the Tobey Maguire figure, and that was left over for the C team, because again, the solid build quality to the musculature that you're finding here on the thighs, the legs, the arms, the torso, even though from a preferential standpoint, I kind of wish that he was a little on the bulkier side, because I can see some replications, some retooling and reutilization of some of the buck sculpting that was happening with that Daredevil figure, as far as the way that the biceps and the shoulders and even a little bit of this abdominal piece is constructed. And that works for Daredevil. For 2099 Spidey, I understand that technically he was like that in some of the earlier comics. He was still, nevertheless, a slimmed down Miguel O'Hara. But for some reason, when I think of Miguel O'Hara in the much more contemporary fashion, whether it be Spider-Verse or even some of the more modernized comics, I think of a hulkier, I don't want to say hulkier, but just a much more built-up, swole Miguel O'Hara that's supposed to kind of portray this much more antagonizing and even intimidating Spidey. But I reiterate that this is in fact in the title. It's the comic-based Spidey 2099. It's much more out of a subjective preference that I would have appreciated some extra musculature, but that's not to say that it's a right or wrong approach to give us a much more slimmer down body. Just as long as the quality of the body is overall done really well as far as the tooling, assembly, and the solid build nature, and I can definitely attest to that because the way that everything just feels in hand is pretty good. Even down to the little spikes that I was kind of worried about, as far as the little spikes and claws kind of protruding from his forearms that are archetypal 2099 Spidey. I was kind of worried that these things are either going to be a little too flimsy to the point of warping, or a little too rigid to the point of breakage should they be bent or fall on some kind of hard surface and end up breaking apart. But thankfully, they're made out of a very fine rubberized filament that feels like a very cross in between, to where they don't feel terribly rigid but also not terribly flimsy, somewhere in a nice delicate balance that you can see right there, that they're kind of bending by a firm press, but they never feel like they're going to warp and stay in a warped state. They're going to fold back to their original stance, and are going to be in good form when displayed, especially since this is some of the more angular, pointy parts of the overall ensemble that make up the symbol in the front and the red parts, because that's very quintessential 2099 Spidey. That also includes the little decorations that he has got going on his mask to then create some form of expression with the futuristic style, which I'm happy to report are not just paint apps, but also sculpted on top of the surface of the overall head sculpt that I mostly like, save for a little bit of some bulbiness. I don't know if, again, that's leaning into my subjective take of preferring a much muscular body as far as the overall sculpt of the top upper body parts of the shoulders and the pecs and the torso. But at the same time, I do feel like this whole top part of the head is a little too egg-shaped for my liking. I kind of wish that he was a bit more on the oval side. But at the same time, it's not necessarily a make or break. It's just leans a little bit more towards that subjective take. And overall, the deco, as well as the overall quality assurance of the surface, the sculpt work, is very top notch. And since it's using the overall quality tooling that I've likened more so to the Daredevil figure as opposed to the Toby one, the articulation is also going to be pretty good as well. That head that I was remarking is able to rotate the full 360 at the top of the neck joint, as well as being able to very decently tilt almost all the way up, as well as slightly inclined downwards. But if you want some further extension side to side or even up and down, of course, you could see that it's able to do so via the base of the neck joint that is also able to flex in all kinds of directions right there. So it's pretty feasible. And I think my favorite part would have to be the inclination from side to side, because I can feel the two different joints kind of working in tandem to be making sure that that happens for you. So that's pretty nice. The arm joints are able to fully rotate 360 degrees, no problem. Hinge inside is able to allow some extension towards the sides and up beyond the shoulder point, to the point where it's able to break slightly the 180 degree angle. And if you can't already note, you of course have the butterfly joint that allows flexibility forwards and backwards like so. Pretty good. As well as some slight shrugging. Now, you did hear just a tiny little bit of squeaking, but trust me, it's in no way, shape, or form as damaging or intrusive as that of the Mafex Toby, unfortunately. But you can see right there some really great flexibility out of the box on both shoulders. Bicep joints are fully able to rotate in place 360 degrees, no problem. Two elbow joints that can fully bend all the way up. And then, of course, you have the wrist ball joint that allows the hand to have the rod rotate on it 360 degrees, no problem. As well as the cut in the middle of the joint that is able to flex the hand forwards and backwards like so. Now, the torso joints, that's where things get just a little complicated, even though I'm not able to go into full disclosure as to why just yet. All I will say right now is that you're able to nudge the middle torso joint side to side at a good amount, almost a full perpendicular angle, but it's not able to fully rotate 360 degrees, at least not on its own as it is right there. There's some flexibility, there's some options, but again, I can't really do that until I mention a little gimmick that they decided to incorporate with the Mafex comic-based 2099 Spidey. But we'll get to that momentarily. All you need to know, though, right now is that you're able to nudge it side to side, and crunching downwards is a little on the limited side. It can kind of get by a little bit right there. Extension towards the back is a bit more favorable, but of course that creates just some slight gappage and a little bit of the joint exposure happening there towards the top. The waist joint, on the other hand, is fully flexible, able to rotate the full 360, no problem whatsoever, as well as pretty much being able to crunch and incline and extend side to side, up and down, left and right, all the way around like so. So it's probably one of the more flexible, but at the same time, it never feels terribly loose or just all over the place. It still feels firm and very well tooled as far as the sculpting of the joints to make sure that no problems can happen right there. As far as the top legs, they can extend upwards like so. Pretty decent, actually pretty good, even beyond a little bit of the hip joint right about right there. But of course, you know exactly why that is. It's because when you extend the legs either towards the back like so, or even off to the side, and allowing good mobility as far as Splitsville happening right about there in the middle, you then, of course, are treated to some slight drop-down mechanics when placing the legs back into their original default position. So you're going to have to shift them a little bit upwards. However, I don't get that seesaw effect like I was having with the Mafex Toby. They feel individual of each other. It looks like they have a different rig happening on the underside of the diaper there. And it's one that I really wish, if they can do it here, I don't understand why we couldn't have it happen with the Mafex Toby. I've heard rumblings that there's some way to modify that within the community. Yeah, that's great, that's dandy, and I've already seen a handful of comments from people saying that there's mods that you can do for the shoulders for Toby, the custom heads. Guys, I'm reviewing the default figure out of the box. Mods for figures is the same thing as mods for games. Guess who's doing that? The community. And that's great on the community. They are goated for that, as the kids like to say. But I'm still going to criticize Mafex. Alright? I'm sorry. A criticism that thankfully Mafex 299 here is saving himself from because they don't have that problem happening with the legs right there, but I digress. The two knee joints, however, are still able to flex all the way upwards, and they do have that, I don't want to say patent, but very recognizable Mafex joint that I really like for the knees. And then, of course, more ball joints at the ankles that allow the feet to be able to flex downwards about that far, extend upwards about that far, and also fully rotate at the top of the ball joint, or even slightly incline at the bottom with a little rod that kind of sticks into the middle part of the overall foot piece right there. Now, you do have toes that are able to bend upwards somewhat, but they do feel a little stiff and a little limited on mine. I don't know if maybe that's just an isolated incident or that's just naturally how they sculpted the toe pieces for 2099 Spidey here, but on the bright side, at least the majority of the articulation here is overall really well done as far as the tooling. Nothing feels like it's got any major QC problems. I feel comfortable actually playing with the goddamn thing and never feeling like I'm gonna break a piece or having to resort to, again, mods or tools or things that I need to do as the customer, because frankly, for the money, that's something that the company should be doing. I'm sorry, but I'm still gonna be calling that out regardless of which character or which company I am reviewing. And since this company is Mafex, it's going to be coming with a good amount of accessories to kind of set it apart, one of which in particular feeds into that mechanic, that gimmick that I was referring to when talking about the mid-torso. But before we get to that, let's cover some of the basics that Mafex is always known to include, which are of course going to be the hand accessories, of which you have the very staple ones that, again, I'm a little on the split side as far as their functionality, which has to be the magnetized hands and feet. Again, I appreciate their inclusion, but if you're going to do that, the magnets need to be a little bit stronger. But I digress. I feel like at this point, they're just going to be included there to check off that box. And let's face it, it's not necessarily going to be the more frequented form of accessory when it comes to a Mafex figure, let alone a Mafex spider related figure. You're predominantly going to be messing around with the other hand accessories that are a bit more on the gesturing side, the ones that have a bit more functionality as far as feeding into the personality, feeding into the powers for Spidey that make archetypal sense. By default, he's got the fisted hands, but then on the side here, you're going to have some semi-relaxed hands to kind of be in a neutral position. You're then going to have, of course, the wall-crawling hands, but then kind of sandwiched a little bit in the middle. You're going to have these hands that are quite literally in the middle. I don't know how else to really express it except to say that some of the exterior hands on the side here are a little bit more coiled down than the ones in the middle that are a bit more extended. It's almost kind of like free fall sort of hands, if you want to label them as such. And then over here, very similar to some other comic-based characters that have been recently revealed by Mafex, Daredevil in particular, you have like these flat hands to kind of either be used for some kind of Tom Cruise running pose, or if you want to do some kind of, like I mentioned before, some kind of free fall swan dive sort of style pose that you want to put him in, you could do so as well. And naturally, being a Spidey figure, you're going to have web holding hands. And being that this is specifically the 2099 Spidey, you're going to have like these clawing hands. Because, like I mentioned before, this version of Spidey, Miguel O'Hara, is meant to be a bit more animalistic. He kind of feeds a little, or kind of leans more into his animalistic tendencies, being bit by the spider, and therefore not only is he going to be utilizing fangs, but he's also going to be using claws that are baked into his hands. So I like that they went with this gesture for this specific pair. What I don't like is that if a company, whether it be Mafex, Figuarts, or hell even Marvel Legends, are going to be doing claws for the hands, then man, I'm sorry, but you have to go a bit on all the way in that direction. Because, swear to God, when I pulled an awful lot of these hand accessories out of the box, I legit thought that they completely screwed things up and gave me a very defective unit. Because I pulled some of these hand accessories out of the box, out of the little plastic tray on the inside, and thought to myself, ugh, you got some like plastic residue kind of trailing off from the fingertips. I don't know why it is that they didn't overlook this, and you got some major QC problems, and I was very quick to almost report this in the review first and foremost. Only to then get to the second pair and realize that you have those little pieces also being found on that pair, not just on 1 or 2 fingers, but literally all 10 fingers, and that's when it finally dawned on me, oh, these are supposed to be the claws. I'm sorry, but they're just a little bit on the small side. If you're gonna do full-on, very sharp claws for the fingers, very akin to 2099 Spidey, then there gotta be a bit more pronounced. They have to have some kind of emphasis, something that feels like they're gonna be much more tactile and used by the character, because I feel like these are just a little bit too small, so I would have liked them to be even bigger than this to, again, kind of emphasize the clawed nature to his hands, or just don't do them at all and just give me some default hands, to be quite honest. And the only ones that don't come with the claws baked into them are naturally the fisted hands that he's got by default, or the web holding hands that I mentioned before with the little hole cut out, which means that he does come with web accessories of his own. And it is a little strange. I understand that his character does not do the traditional web shooting sort of style to his hand gesture. He just kind of like shoots them out or just swings from them. So I get that that's going to get some getting used to as far as not having that included pair. But what I do really respect is that even though the sculpting and the inclusion of the web accessories is pretty much identical to that of practically every Mafex Spidey figure that's been released, as far as having the 2 short ones, the 2 long ones with the hoops that can fit into the wrists, and then of course the L-shaped ones to be utilized in those web holding hands to make him look like he's swinging from them, I really do appreciate that they gave it a blue tint to signify that these are very specific to 2099 Spidey. Even though the hint in and of itself is leaning more towards being like an indigo color as opposed to the navy blue from his suit, but I still like that they're practically color-coded, so if I ever lose them, I know that they belong to this specific Miguel O'Hara Spidey as opposed to any other in my collection. And much like with some other Mafex Spideys, he comes with bonus head accessories. A little salty that we don't have a full-blown Miguel O'Hara head from the comics as far as having the red Irish hair, the Irish part of his heritage. But at the same time, I do appreciate that you have not only a different expression for the sculpted masked face, where you can tell that he's got a little bit more of an aggressive brow there at the very top. If you put them next to each other, you can definitely tell the much more leering look to the eyes right there in the center. But then you also have a half unmasked face. I don't know, again, if maybe it's a licensing thing. Could have appreciated a bonus head completely unmasked, but at the same time, I do like that the sculpting for the chin and the teeth and the expression to be, again, feeding into that antagonizing nature is illustrated very well with even just the mouth. That is pretty cool. I really appreciate that, and I do like the sculpting of the mask looking like it's legitimately being pulled up from the upper side part of the nose, so I really dig that. And to match the unmasked bottom half, you have a bonus neck stump with a little bit of the skin exposed there on the top part of the neck. And obviously, I never really tried to pull this off since this is the only head that you're going to be able to use this neck stump on. And the swapping process is pretty similar to that of previous Mafex. It's very intuitive, very smooth. So I do dig that, but again, there's still a little part of me that wishes that they would have included a Miguel O'Hara completely unmasked head sculpt in place for what they opted for their bonus big gimmick for Miguel O'Hara's Spidey here. Which is funny considering that it's centered around the one little characteristic about his suit, which I'm arguably one of the biggest detractors of. Of course, I'm talking about the cape, my least favorite part of the overall Spidey 2099 suit. I've mentioned this a handful of times. I never liked the cape. Hell, I don't even like the cape on Spider-Man Unlimited. I just don't like Spidey with capes. There's just something really strange about it. And if we want to toss it up to something even earlier that predates that, it would have to be the web wings from his original appearance back in the 60s. I don't like it. So I knew that was going to be some kind of baggage coming with the Mafex 2099 Spidey, since he is going to be coming with the cape. And you'll note that I did in fact kind of skip over this when covering the figure, most definitely around the articulation portion, since the cape is found on the back over here. You'll notice that this is the default cape he comes with at the start, and you'll see that it is technically articulated. You can kind of lift it up and down. It is a little on the squeaky side after kind of messing with it a handful of times, but you can move it all about. It's not terribly rigid. You'll notice that it's also kind of held together by a simple tiny little peg right there that fits into the little hole there at the top part of his trapezius. But as far as the sculpting of the piece in and of itself, it's not terrible, but it's also not the best either. I appreciate that it's consistent as far as color hue, color tinting with the remaining webs that I mentioned earlier, but the actual construction in the middle is not bad. It's towards the end pieces right here, the little frails that are supposed to trail off, that are kind of simulating this rather torn apart look that is very indicative of the portrayal of the cape from the comics. Not the biggest fan of it, especially realized here in plastic form. Ever so often I'm kind of handling the figure, I'm kind of messing with it, and I still feel like the cape just kind of comes in the way of whatever articulation I want to flex, whatever kind of handling pose I want to put him in. The cape is always there. And I know that sounds like an old man yelling at clouds kind of argument, but what I'm trying to articulate here, no pun intended, is that whenever I suppose, like for example, if I want to mess with like the torso or the arm or the leg and I'm handling the figure from like the middle part right here, I feel like I'm pressing on the cape. And I feel like over time, there's gonna have some kind of wear and tear on the plastic in and of itself. Or worse yet, one of these much thinner pieces towards the end parts right here are gonna just frankly tear off. They don't feel that cheap, but they also don't feel that strongly either. So as from a conceptual standpoint, I understand why it had to be included in there, but from execution, I feel like they could have done something with the plastic that's very similar to that of the spikes here on the gauntlets to at least give me some kind of reaffirmation that it's going to be okay as far as this default piece. At least a little bit of the sculpting with the little web lines kind of built into or kind of carved directly into the cape itself is pretty nice. The funny thing is that it's the peg sliding out of that hole is not necessarily the intended way to swap it for the other cape pieces that they decided to toss in. They threw in not one, but two back pieces with their own capes. This is the method that they decided to incorporate into the cape swapping functionality. Not only do you get the cape pieces, but naturally their own back pieces to swap them in, which means that yes, the figure is supposed to come apart at the back torso piece. You're technically supposed to remove the back plate, and this is exactly why I mentioned that the mid-torso joint is not able to swivel all the way across by default. Technically, if you remove the back piece to be able to swap for either of these cape pieces, you can then rotate the mid-torso joint completely 360 degrees, no problem. It's just a shame that that's, frankly, the only way to make that happen and not by default like some other Mafex figures or Mafex Spidey figures at that are able to cover their bases in that joint. So it's a bit of a trade-off that they incorporated that, and even further, I've already had my share of occasions where I've kind of toyed a little bit with that mid-torso joint, whether it be in that rotation point, or when I just simply try to crunch the torso, crunch the obliques, etc., and the back piece starts to come off. It's not necessarily loose. These pegs fit very snug into the back piece that exposes us to the joints happening inside, as far as the butterfly joint, which is then able to flex almost all the way towards the back. He's able to pretty much take both of his arms and flex them the full a 180-degree angle in that direction if you're able to remove the back piece, to kind of give you a preview as to how the sausage is made as far as the articulation. But when doing so, don't get me wrong, it clasps into his back a really good amount. It's just that if I ever want to push any of the mid-torso joints to their limits, there's already been like 1 or 2 instances where the back piece started to come off a little bit. Not completely, but just a little at the crackway point on the sides, whether it be on the like back latimus dorsi or on the top part. But that's only because of this functionality. Thankfully, that hasn't happened with any other Mafexes. It still, however, kind of makes me question as to why it is that they opted for this method as opposed to simply just having the cape be its own little like rod piece, be removable, because you can see that one of these pieces only has the one peg right here, which is meant to be for a much more pronounced, wider, and larger cape, stylized to look a little bit more widespread than the default one. Functionality wise though, it's the same. It's able to rotate on that peg as well as being able to flap up and down. Now naturally being a bit more wide, it's not going to be able to flex all the way up like so. It kind of comes into conflict with the back piece, but of course you'll note that you have a completely different style right there. Where things get just a little stranger would have to be that second piece that I guess you can make the argument explains as to why we're doing this whole back plate method to this approach. And that's because this cape is able to split right down the middle and therefore utilizes 2 pegs with 2 holes adjacent to each other to be able to give you like this wingspan effect when you flex the pieces. They can also move and articulate in the same kind of directions as far as flapping up and down and rotate virtually all the way around. Of course, they're going to come into conflict with each other because they're perpendicular to each other. But at the same time, you'll see that it's mainly this piece as to why it is that they went with the method that they did to be able to remove the back plate. It's because they wanted to include this. But again, why couldn't they simply just not give us this and instead give us a Miguel O'Hara head? I don't know. Maybe I'm in the minority with that, but I personally would have sacrificed this whole backplate approach and just give us some cape pieces to be able to pop in and out of that peg, out of that slot, and instead just give us a Miguel O'Hara head. And you'll notice that the splitting cape piece right here for the back plate is a little on the wider side, but also has a slightly different pattern to the outermost parts of the cape sculpted into it versus that of either the default one or even the wider one that I set aside over there. And there's yet another reason for why that is because they included 4 much narrower, I guess you could say, arm attachments for the cape to make it seem like he's extending the cape a la the web wings from the original Spidey appearance in the 60s. Again, I get it. It's comic based for 2099 Spidey as well, but I'm not the biggest fan of it. Again, appreciate not only the color coding to match the consistency of the blue tint for the web accessories and the cape, as well as still having some lining of the web lines sculpted into them. And you'll notice that we have 4. You have 2 slightly wider ones than the other 2 narrower ones. Plus, you also note that one of the sides has this little peg. Now, it's going to take some trial and error, but you'll notice that when you kind of fit the pegs into either of his triceps, which of course have the holes to fit into them, you'll notice that there's some slight curvature happening with some of the pieces, and that's because they're technically supposed to have like the pointy parts facing down to make sure that this side right here is curved and sculpted to then naturally fit into the tricep and the shoulder and kind of flush up against it. So they can technically be swappable in between arms as long as the orientation is having this part facing down. But the little puzzle solver part of my brain kind of wants to deduce that the wider pieces are supposed to go with the split up cape that is able to be articulated in 2 positions, and then the narrower ones are able to line up a little bit more friendly, so to speak, with the wider cape. Again, you can style it the way that you want to. There's no rule set, there's no right or wrong answer, but to me it just looks like the cutouts on the sides here are able to flush, at least with the wide ones, are able to flush with the narrower 2-piece cape over there, versus the slightly smaller pieces are able to flush with the much wider one. But still, the fact that they were included at all, to me, it just gives me a little bit more to look out for as far as pieces that I can easily lose, and it only makes me wish that we could have gotten a Miguel O'Hara completely unmasked head sculpt in its stead. But at least the cape will end up being more dynamic on the Mafex as opposed to the Marvel Legends. You knew this was coming, Pete. Yes, if you couldn't already tell by either the thumbnail or my habit of doing this on the channel as far as comparing one very high price point versus a much more low budget friendly one, it would be the eventual comparison between the prosumer Mafex model and then the Marvel Legends much more affordable model that could be found in brick and mortar stores or online. And here is yet another argument that despite my personal subjective takes versus some creative options or approaches that they did with some of the accessories, specifically that cape habit or that cape approach, that method of swapping out the back plates and the way that they animated it, at least we still get a variety of hands as opposed to simply just two extra hands. Now, granted, that is still more than some of the more recent outings that Marvel Legends has been doing, where you only get one pair of extra hands and that is it. At least with the Marvel Legends, you do get six, but after finally revisiting this guy to pull him out of the box and present him before you inside of this review, god damn, it's just yet another argument that the Mafex, you get what you paid for. As far as the contrast between a $25 to $30 figure and an $80 to $90, possibly even $100-ish, considering the stuff that's going on with tariffs, which has since laxed up a little bit, but it's still, technically speaking, in effect. But I'm sorry, I really can't bring myself to say that the money isn't exactly worth it, because despite where I lean subjectively on the way that they handle the cape, again, I would gladly take the alternate heads, even though I would prefer the Miguel O'Hara one, but at least you get the variances in the hand accessories, the different gestures that favor the posability, and then when it really comes down to it, the bottom line is that you're getting a much more solid outing as far as the sculpt work, as well as the tooling of the articulation, the paint applications, despite the slight little variance with the teeth, as I mentioned, over the abdomen area, but everything else just feels very coherent with one another. Whereas this guy, again, revisiting him, pulling him out of the plastic tray and out of the retro card box, I was like, god damn, the legs are loose. It's very difficult to pose. It feels kind of stiff around the ankle area to the point where even giving it a pass with the hairdryer, I'm like, damn, this thing feels brittle. It feels like it's going to break. And then you have the translucent cape, which is not necessarily articulated. It's not as dynamic as I would have liked it. I get it. You know, it's $25, but I feel like when you're looking at a major conglomerate like Hasbro, especially with what could be considered an awful lot of people, an awful lot of collectors and Spidey fans out there, their favorite version of Spidey, which is $20.99, believe it or not, there's still going to be some people out there who want a definitive $20.99 Spidey. And right now, despite the major gap in price, I still think that it's worth the long shot of saving up to bring that Mafex version into your collection. Even though, credit where credit is due, the Mafex, despite not having any kind of claws in the fist, which totally makes sense because you have to close up the fist to form it, but then the open extended hands have absolutely no claws or anything to indicate otherwise, save for the actual designated clawed hands that he has on by default. Pulling him right out of the box, you'll notice that he has much more pronounced nails on the clawed up hands versus that of the original $20.99 comic-based Mafex, where you have consistency across the board on the different hand accessories. Sure, you have the claws present, but again, harking back to what I mentioned before, it's just, they're just so minute that I feel like they need to be pretty much at this extent in terms of length, or just none at all. So funny enough, that's probably the only thing that the Marvel Legends technically did get right in this retro card series. And then maybe depending on the person you ask, they might prefer the slightly much more purplish tint to the blue, the reflective blue coating that he's got on his actual suit, as well as the approach or the design that they went for the center symbol there on his chest, as well as that goddamn groin area that's just massive. He is packing. But for me, and my literal money, it would have to be the Mafex that is manages to secure a very solid 8 out of 10, even though I still would have liked a much more bulkier build that was distancing itself a little bit from the recent Daredevil. It's still one of the much more solid outings with very minimal QC problems, good accessories, good quality tooled together, and I really dig the assembly of the head accessories, though I would have preferred a standard Miguel O'Hara unmasked head sculpt apart from the capes, even though, again, they at least managed to do something to make the cape less abrasive from a design standpoint, something that I've always been kind of against. I just wish that the potential really would have been taken advantage of as far as making the plastic feel a little bit much more solid, less likely to break during the handling that I've done with the figure already. And then on top of that, being able to maybe kind of stray away from this whole backplate methodology. And I'm hoping that I don't necessarily have it become the norm when it comes to swapping out wing accessories or cape accessories, not just for Spidey specifically, but other Marvel and even DC characters across the board. Now, it could be a little out of line here, but I feel like a pattern is sort of developing in the form of comic-based characters getting the much more quality outings out of Mafex as opposed to the movie tie-in stuff. I don't know, maybe I need to collect some more movie-based figures outside of just Marvel, like some of the John Wick stuff, etc. Maybe even some of the Boys figures. Ever so often, I'm kind of tempted by that Homelander that recently got revealed with all the blood covering his face. It's pretty dope. But at the same time, I feel like some of the best stuff from Mafex comes in the form of comic-based portrayals of characters. So what are you guys' favorite takes on the Mafex figures that are based on those comic interpretations? Do you think that they do them justice? No pun intended. Is there one that you're waiting for them to tackle? Or are you simply just in the waiting room for some eventual reissue? Because lately, Mafex is starting to not only delay certain figures, and that does get kind of frustrating, but while we wait, it looks like they're giving some people a kind of a second or even a third chance to own some figures that they may have missed out on. We're getting a reissue of a brown and yellow suit Wolverine, Miles Morales, which I've already put down my pre-order for, and hell, even some like toy exhibition exclusives like the Night Crusader Batman and the Scarlet Spider with like a different color variants. Do you think that this is possibly opening the floodgates for more reissues to get kind of like the remaster treatment? I'm eager to see what you guys have to say down in the comments, and while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, take care and stay humble. Peace.